Good afternoon. This is Ginger from ACESDV. Thank you so much for joining our webinar this afternoon. Our webinar for this month is Know Your Rights for Immigrant Survivors and Service Providers. We have with us Reina Montoya from Aliento and Judy Flanagan from the Phoenix Legal Action Network. I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves a little bit more in depth. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions as we're going along, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A. If you would like to remain anonymous, that's fine. Just let us know. We won't say your name as we answer those questions, and we will go ahead and answer questions as we go along. And there should be a little bit of time at the end also to do some discussion if you have any further follow-up questions. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Reina and Judy, and they can go ahead and get started.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Ginger.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I just was going to say thank you, Ginger. But go ahead, Reina.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Ginger, for hosting us today. My name is Reina Montoya. I am the founder of Aliento, which is a community-based organization that we work predominantly with undocumented youth and mixed status families to transform a lot of the pain and fear into hope and action. We have arts and healing workshops, community organizing and leadership development workshops for people. And we're based in Mesa, Arizona, and we do some work in Phoenix as well. And I am the founder of Aliento at the organization, and I'm also a DACA recipient. So thank you for having me today.
And I'm Judy Flanagan. I guess in my private life, I'm an immigration attorney for the last 20 years here in Phoenix. And I'm also a board member of the Phoenix Legal Action Network, which is a new organization that started basically in the despair of the 2016 election, a sense of needing to maybe work with other attorneys that are doing progressive lawyering. And one of the projects that we came up with, meeting in people's living rooms, was the Justice for Immigrant Families program that we have initiated. We now have we've been fundraising and doing all kinds of work to get an attorney started that will be working with non-detained immigrants that are in the jurisdiction of the Phoenix Immigration Court. So it's a new resource for people. One that we feel is sorely needed. So we're here today to talk about Know Your Rights, information you can provide to immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and also a little bit of information for service providers yourself and some of the things you should look for if you ever have encounters with ICE. So. Okay. So this is what we'll cover today, rights of immigrant survivors in encounters with police and also with ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the interior enforcement, law enforcement agency for the Customs and Border Protection. The Border Patrol does, as its name implies, more work towards the border, although that is increasingly encroaching, I think, on the center of Arizona as well. And then we'll talk about different places that people can encounter ICE, Border Patrol, or just regular law enforcement at traffic stops, at their home, workplace, CBP or Border Patrol checkpoints, and certain sensitive locations such as shelters or courtrooms. We'll also talk about what happens if somebody is taken into ICE custody, and then just generally some tips for domestic violence shelter workers. And I thought it would be helpful, Reina, also just chime in as you've seen things happen, with folks that you're working with. But there's been a lot of changes under the Trump administration. Within the first 90 days that he became president, he issued a number of executive orders, which, were a number of them, but essentially they were saying that there is no longer any prosecutorial discretion for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Essentially what it means is that all non-citizens, including permanent residents that may have violated the law, are targets. And I also put that in there about the citizens in Montana who speak Spanish, because apparently the Border Patrol was harassing some citizens in Montana just because they were speaking Spanish. So we all need to be vigilant. DACA, as you I'm sure have heard, which is a form of prosecutorial discretion, has been ended by edict of President Trump. There are a number of lawsuits going on, so there are some exceptions to that rule, but it's on its way out. And in my practice, ICE is really on steroids these days. They are bound and determined to pick up anybody. In the old days, you used to be able to argue for some kind of discretion, but even if you don't have a criminal record these days, people are getting picked up. And the situation in immigration court is not any better. It's at a much faster pace now. Judges are not giving continuances, or the continuances are much shorter than they used to be, 2 to 3 months as opposed to 6 months to a year previously. Immigration judges have been given quotas, essentially, performance evaluations. They've been given a certain number of cases that they need to finish within a year, or their status will be reviewed negatively. It's a huge concern for all of us in the advocacy community that, judges who are supposed to be impartial are picking up the pace simply because they need to get favorable employment reviews. And then the Attorney General Jeff Sessions has also ended administrative closure as a general rule. Under the last administration, we were able to close tens of thousands of cases that were really not a priority for the government. That is now over with, except for a few certain cases. A matter of concern for those of us that do asylum work with victims of domestic violence back in their home country. The Attorney General certified a case to himself, which he can do, which is called matter of AR. Well, it's a different case that he certified to himself, but essentially implicates the holding in matter of ARCG, which is a Board of Immigration's appeals case that recognizes domestic violence as a basis for asylum. So we are very worried. And all of this quickness in making things go through the system faster has some, really huge implications for VAWA self-petitioners and U visa applicants because of the timelines. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but moving cases through faster and judges that won't allow continuances is a huge, huge problem for people that have no other relief other than maybe VAWA, in particularly U visa applicants, because it's taking so long these days. So obviously our goal here is to try and keep clients out of removal proceedings. It's just super important these days. And we're providing you some basic information here, but both Reina and I really feel that clients really need to learn this information firsthand. Mm-hmm. So Reina, can you talk a little bit about some of the organizations and also perhaps Aliento and what kinds of presentations you do?
Yeah, so here in the Phoenix area, we have a lot of organizations that are able to provide either free or a very low cost to be able to either renew DACAs or provide Know Your Rights training, just like this one, but with actually participants and people who are directly impacted. And also we have like a defense packet, which it pretty much gets a lot of information where they can have it in a secure place, and they're able to pretty much prepare a family packet about like date of birth and all the things that they need to think about in case if they get to be put in deportation proceedings. So then they have an emergency contact, especially a lot of the moms or fathers start worrying about their kids, their dogs, and even plans. We have heard in the past that when people are detained, they make different judgments because they feel that they don't have a plan. So some of those organizations here in the in the Phoenix metropolitan area, our Aliento, that we do a lot of know your rights and family preparedness. Also, we help with the emotional well-being. We do it in a more non-clinical sense, so it's more of a support group. People have thought about it as the 12-step program, but for undocumented families. Puente does a lot of deportation defense. They also help with DACA renewals. We have Center for Neighborhood Leadership, or CNL, that they have also done Know Your Rights in the past. Chicanos por la Causa also does different types of reliefs, and what they also offer is more about counseling for undocumented people at a very low cost. I believe it's like $40 or $60. Promise Arizona also does some of the work in terms of like know your rights and educating the community, but they are focused more on voter registration. The ACLU has a really cool tool that it's like in your cell phone that you're able to actually report any discrepancies that had happened to people related to violations of First Amendment rights or any other rights. And then the Florence Project, and that goes into detention and actually has attorneys that represent some of the people. In Tucson, we have Keep Tucson Together, and there's also a scholarships AC. And that's kind of more in the Phoenix, Tucson area, but Judy and I were discussing, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some more links to Ginger that she can later on share for all of you.
Yeah, we started to get some information for some of the further out from Phoenix areas, workshops that are being held in Nogales. There's groups up in Flagstaff as well, so we'll try to, as Reina said, get that to Ginger to have that available for people.
And then something that happens here in Phoenix as well, if they are Mexican nationals, if they were born in Mexico, the Mexican consulate actually has sometimes like a ability to have some contracts with some attorneys. So then they're able to provide at least a consultation at a pro bono or very low cost. And sometimes they also help with the fee depending on what type of case that they're fighting.
And that may be happening down in Tucson as well. I know the consulate here also has presentations by attorneys and community groups at the consulate. So that's really helpful. So let's sort of move into the meat of our presentation here. You know, what happens if, and this is really geared for your clients, the folks at the shelter. You know, what happens if ICE is knocking on somebody's door, somebody's home? So, you know, can ICE enter somebody's home? You bet. And it often happens by what's called consent, or what ICE calls consent. They knock on the door, somebody opens the door, or a kid in the family opens the door, and all of a sudden an officer has his boot inside somebody's house. They start chatting, and the officer asks, is it okay if I look for, you know, Jose, who we have this warrant for? And the person allows the person in because there isn't a Jose there. Maybe they used to live there. And all of a sudden, they're starting to arrest people in the house that don't have papers. You know, it's a real issue. And what the basic message I think we need to let people know is that people should not be opening their doors to somebody they don't know. And kids need to be trained on this as well. You know, don't have your child opening the door without verifying who is at the door. And it really takes some training. You need to tell your kid, look, we can't do that. Never open the door to a stranger. And ICE, very typically, they don't have uniforms on. They look like, I don't know, frankly, I think they look like drug dealers, the ones that I look at. They've got long hair. They have long hair, they have tattoos, they're wearing t-shirts. You know, they look like either Joe Schmo or a drug dealer. So you can't tell by looking at somebody that they're an ICE officer. In fact, I'm not even sure I've even seen an ICE officer with a uniform. The only official way ICE is supposed to get inside a house is if they have what's called a judicial warrant. And of course, most clients aren't going to know what that is, but ICE typically never has a judicial warrant. A judicial warrant is signed by a U.S. District Court judge. They do not have them. They have what they call warrants, which are administrative warrants, but they are not sufficient to enter somebody's home without consent, of course.
And when we talk, I'm gonna chime in, Judy, a little bit about
Sure.
a lot of people ask, well, how can I guarantee that this person has a judicial warrant or not? And a lot of people are really scared because they're like, what about if they do have a warrant? Like, am I then allowed to actually like open the door? They technically have to open the door if it's a judicial warrant, but then people is like, how can I verify if it is or if it is not? So then what we tell people is that typically like behind the door, if there's a window there, there's a way for them to actually see it without having to open the actual door. I don't know if you want to say anything else on that, Judy.
Well, I think the problem is that it's way too complicated for your average person. Before I practiced immigration law, I wouldn't have had any idea whether this administrative warrant that's signed by some supervisor at ICE isn't a good warrant. You know, most people, they're going to be scared. There's going to be loud, angry voices outside. It's going to be almost impossible for somebody to know whether, or to even have the wherewithal to say, hey, just, you know, put that under the door, let me see it. Frankly, most people should just never open the door. Don't open the door, and if they do have a judicial warrant, then they can break down your door. Well, okay, so you might have to get a new door. But I think it's too complicated really to ask people to try and look at this when they're under such stress and make a decision about whether this order is good or not. You know, sometimes we tell people, get the order, take a picture of it, send it to your lawyer or to somebody that might know, but realistically, is that going to happen? I mean, what do you think, Reina?
I mean, that's always very tricky. I think that at that moment, I mean, if you said that they can just like, if they do have a warrant, they can just pretty much break into the door. I, as a person who has DACA and right now knowing how ICE is, I wouldn't feel comfortable opening the door. So I would probably let them wait until they break in.
Yeah, I mean, and I would have to say that 99% of the time they do not have judicial warrants. People can be pretty safe in judging that they don't. But there's going to be a lot of noise outside and people are scared. But do not give permission. You know, the message to tell people is do not give permission to ICE to enter your house.
And people
but it's tricky.
should feel pretty
if you
confident. Sorry, Judy,
Absolutely.
but I would say that people should feel pretty confident. It's their property and it's private property. They cannot come in unless they have a warrant. So don't be afraid to give that recommendation to your clients.
Absolutely. And, you know, the case law is actually pretty good. Your home is your castle, and the law is pretty strict on Fourth Amendment inability of those officers to go into your house without a search warrant. And again, ICE officers are not going to have the kind of warrant that they need to search your house unless you let them in. So again, keep them out. And then just the bottom question there about whether, you know, ICE says that they're looking for somebody, what I mentioned initially, if the homeowner or the renter. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're the renter or you're the homeowner. It's your house. What tends to happen is that they go in, the person isn't there, or maybe they have an old address for somebody, but they start asking everybody, do you have papers? And people start talking. And what happens, Reina?
Once you actually give them the ability to come into your house, they can start taking anyone that they don't have documentation or that they're suspicious of not having documentation. So that's something that is very dangerous because we have seen in the past people coming in and they were looking for Jose, as Yuri said, and then they take Jose, Maria, and Pedro. So then there has been cases where they take like more than one person, then typically kids start crying, and then there's not a plan about what happens, who takes care of the kids, what's going to happen in that case. So then it can be pretty traumatizing for any family that is going through that.
Absolutely. So don't let them in, you know, for the person that used to live there or somebody you may have known but isn't there that particular day. Just don't open the door is the advice to give. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide here. You know, basic immigration law that I think often attorneys sometimes forget as well is that the government or the Department of Homeland Security or ICE, the interior enforcement folks, they have the burden of proving if somebody is not from this country or that they are, in these awful words that we use, alien, they are an alien. But how do they prove that? You know, they can prove it with a birth certificate or a passport, or maybe they've had a prior encounter with somebody and they have information in their computer. But the way that ICE typically proves alienage in these cases is from, you know, the very mouths of our client. They say, oh, I don't have papers, I'm from Mexico, I don't have a visa, I'm from Australia, whatever. That is how they prove it. And anything, you know, just as they say in the movies, anything you say can and will be used against you, and that's exactly what they do. So silence is golden, and if we can get more and more people to try to do that, we know it's hard. I mean, if you're stopped at a traffic stop, it's hard not to tell the police officer who's asking you what happened. Maybe you caused the accident. You really shouldn't be talking to that police officer, but when they ask you what happened, most of us are telling the officer what happened. And so it's the same concept here. It's not easy to remain silent, but it can really help people avoid deportation.
And sometimes they will be really like tricky. That's not to say that all the cops are the same, but sometimes they will play the nice cop with you and they would try to be like, oh, I see you have an accent. Are you from Sinaloa? Or they will throw in any state from Mexico and they will try to like make small talk with you. And we always want to like warn people that even if they appear to be really nice and that they're on your side, sometimes they're going to use that information against you. So be very careful about what you share.
Yeah, so it's a good idea for clients to tell the officer that, look, I don't want to answer any further questions. One tactic is to show a Know Your Rights card. There are organizations such as the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco. They have what they call red cards that in Spanish and English tell the officer, you know, what the rights are and that the person doesn't wish to speak to the officer. And it's also very hard, I think, to just completely remain silent. Plus, the officer may not know how to interpret that. You can say, I don't want to answer a question. I'd like to speak to my attorney, even if you don't have one. Or I'd like to speak to an attorney before I answer any questions.
And a common question that people ask is like, do you have to have an attorney in mind, or do you have to already choose that attorney? And the answer is no. People have the right to speak to an attorney, and that doesn't mean that they have to know who the attorney is or actually be in contact with the attorney.
Exactly. So let's talk about what's happening if you're a motorist, you're driving and you're stopped by the police. Now, the basic law is that, yes, state law requires the driver to show a driver's license, insurance, and car registration if they're stopped after, hopefully, a valid, reason for stopping somebody. But, valid reasons these days can be cracked windshields that obscure the motorist's, vision. If you don't have a car seat for your children and you have kids bouncing around in the back, it doesn't even have to be a moving violation these days. Those are bases for officers to stop someone. Just recently happened to a client of mine with a cracked windshield on his side of the windshield. So what does a client do, Reina, if they don't have a driver's license? Which is, going to be the situation for many of our clients, right?
Yeah, so I think that what we recommend typically is just to say your name and your date of birth. Because if you are, and this is really up to the client or the person who's being pulled over, but the problem if you show a passport or a matrícula consular, which is like typically ID by the country of origin, then it can get really tricky because then now the officer knows where you're from or where you were born, and they don't know if that means that you don't have the proper documentation to be in the US. And we have heard it all. Like, we have heard people that have had really good experiences about showing their passport, and then the police officer lets them go with just the citation. And the other cases, they see the passport, then they start telling them that they don't have the documents to be here. They ask them if they're citizens. That puts the client or the person in a very bad situation, and then they call ICE. So that's something that, again, like, we cannot make decisions for people, but people need to be aware about what can be the consequences for that.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of, whether the police can search your car. And unless they've arrested somebody, they actually do not have permission to, look in your trunk or look in the rest of your car. They need a search warrant to look in your trunk. They need a search warrant to go in your car. Unless, once again, if the person gives consent. If the officer says, well, is it okay if I look in your trunk? Well, you don't have people in the back. You think, okay, well, that's fine. But then you forget about the little, baggie of marijuana that you have. And boom, that's a valid search and a valid, they can use that against you. So people, again, don't give consent. If you're a driver and you have your driver's license, obviously you're going to show it. Because the immigration attorney in me doesn't really want somebody to show, in quotes, alienage, or that they're from a foreign country if they don't have the right to be here. I really would counsel people not to try to not keep passports and matricula consulares or international driver's license on them, because that clearly shows that you're from that other country and they're going to use that against you.
Something that I used to do before I was able to get a driver's license with DACA is that I will always carry my student ID, because it has my picture and it has my name. I would also carry like my library card. I would carry my Bank of America card that has like your little picture. That's the only reason why I got Bank of America actually in the first place, because when I got it, I was undocumented. So I would have my little picture and my name. So then I would be like, hey, officer, like, this is who I am. I am not lying to you. I am not able to have a driver's license. And if you want, you can give me the citation. But I would stop the conversation there. I would not like self-incriminate or say that I was born in another country. So that's another option that you can give to people, as in like they can show anything that is like US. I know it's not an official ID, but sometimes that de-escalates the situation, especially if it is a traffic violation. Then the officer feels that, okay, you're not lying to him and you're trying to cooperate. So that can be something. I know some other students that actually were pulled over and they were able to just show their like high school diploma, and they show their books and say like, I was just coming from school. And typically they tend to be a little bit more sympathetic. Or when they're saying like, here, like I am part of the PTA meetings at my school, and this is like my school, like sometimes they give moms some of the IDs like that, or parents. So anything that says their names and that is like a US document, I would highly encourage for them to use.
Right, so maybe your Costco card could work also.
Yeah, I know my mom has definitely used her Costco card in the past.
So the general rule in Arizona is that you do have to give the police your name under this section of the law. If you refuse to give your truthful name, it is a class 2 misdemeanor. But it's really, you only, like say if you're walking down the street and a police officer asks what your name is, unless you're like fleeing, the officer has some reason to believe that you're fleeing a crime or you've committed a crime, you don't even have to give your name in that circumstance. So it's only after you've been detained or the officer has reasonable suspicion that the person has committed or is committing or is about to commit a crime that you even have to give your name. So, Rain, I know you said that you advise people to give their name and their date of birth. There's actually no requirement that you give a date of birth. So I would say the less information, the better. It's none of their business, and you're not required under law to provide that information. And if you haven't committed a crime, and this is particularly relevant for passengers, because all the time people get stopped. Maybe the driver does, he's a permanent resident or he has a work permit, he's allowed to be here, but all of his passengers are undocumented. Do those passengers have to provide their name? Well, I think arguably they don't, because they haven't committed a crime. So again, that silence is golden. Please try to have people assert their rights. Officer, am I free to go? You know, if you're walking and you want to leave. If he says no, you know, you do need to cooperate with him, but you only need to give your name. You don't have to tell somebody. If somebody asks, well, so what country are you from? People do not have to answer that question, and they should not if they don't want to be in removal proceedings.
And I just want to highlight what Judy just said. I think that it's so important that we teach people about what are some of the things that they can say. So something that she just mentioned is like, have your clients ask the officer, officer, am I free to go? Officer, am I being arrested? Because then they're remaining in silence, but not completely in silence. So they're actually trying to figure it out, like what's going to be the next step for them. And that's extremely important for clients to know.
Right. So memorize a few good phrases like that. So I think we've talked about this. If you're a passenger in the car, I think you don't have to provide your name unless there's a crime has been committed. Being in the United States unlawfully is not in and of itself a crime. So that if you're in the car with somebody that doesn't have, or the driver is here undocumented, doesn't mean that you're also committing a crime by being in the car with them. So I don't think you have to provide your name. You don't have to provide ID. And you don't have to answer the police officer's questions. Again, I'd like to speak to an attorney. Here's my red card, officer. You know, and it's hard because there's language difficulties too. Many officers don't speak Spanish. If you have that little red card that's in English and Spanish, you can provide that to the officer and it'll say, look, I don't want to talk to you until I have an attorney present. So what happens if you do tell the officer that you're from Mexico or wherever, and you don't have papers? You know, because you're scared and you tell him that, you haven't listened to our fine advice. And you say that, or it pops out, or somebody else in the car says it about you. What happens? You're going to get picked up and you're going to be processed for removal. So, you know, just re-emphasizing that as little information as possible, and certainly don't talk about where you're from. And it can make a difference. I've had a number of clients over the years that actually listened to advice, and they were able to, they didn't get placed in removal proceedings because the government didn't have any information about where they were from, and it is their burden to prove it. So good things to remember. So workplace raids. There certainly have been workplace raids, you know, for decades, more at some times than others. I think we're starting to see more of this now. Raina, do you have any thoughts about this, or have you had any folks that you worked with get picked up in a workplace raid?
Yeah, I mean, typically what happens, or what we have had people that we have worked with that they were picked up at their workplace, and then because of that, and they were already working, they were giving them felony charges for identity theft, which then it's really hard to fight. So that's something that we have faced. Another thing that we have been getting calls this year, it's more about ICE coming to the workplace, but then the person who was working and they were looking for was not at the site at that moment. And then people now have this question about should they go back to work or should they be moving their houses? And I mean, that's a decision that clients would have to make on their own based on the risk. But I mean, that's a very real life situation that could happen. Yeah, and so, you know, ways to protect clients or how they can protect themselves is really, it's the same kind of advice. In a workplace raid, usually when they're doing it, it's because they have probable cause that people are using social security numbers that don't belong to them. So they're there for a reason. Often they have names that they're checking off. But you've got criminal issues, as Reina was mentioning, identity theft issues. Because even if you use an invented social security number, that's a crime in Arizona, even if it doesn't affect somebody.
or there's no victim. But so you've got criminal case issues, you know, and again, statements that you say are going to be used against you. And then also the whole issue of alienage again, you know, where you're from, that's going to be used against people in immigration court. So, you know, you serve two causes by not answering questions, both in your criminal case. You know, your criminal defense attorney will be so happy if you don't talk about, oh yeah, that's my number and I invented it, or I bought it at the Walmart, you know, 10 years ago, and I've been using it ever since. No, 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 stop talking. Do not say anything to, you know, those sheriff's officers that are there, or those Phoenix police, or whoever, whatever law enforcement is there, because you do not make your case better by answering law enforcement's questions. And again, we realize it's a hard thing not to do, to answer questions, but provide your name only, and you will do yourself a big service. If you can try to leave, it may be that they only have warrants for some people. You can ask to leave. Am I being detained? Often they will detain everybody, and just like the situation with a house, they will ask everybody to see if they can gather up other people that aren't even under their search warrant. So by not saying anything, you can protect yourself and not end up in removal proceedings.
Mm-hmm.
CBP or Border Patrol checkpoints, this is a real issue these days. There's both permanent and temporary checkpoints. Those of you that are in the South and also on the west of the state are probably very familiar with these, as well as people that travel off to California or going down to the border. But they're super dangerous places for immigrants these days. Immigration law or federal law says that these checkpoints are the functional equivalent of the border. They're typically within 125 miles of the border. And those officers lean into your window and they ask, are you a U.S. citizen? Folks that are undocumented should not be going by these places. And it's a real problem for people that, we have a lot of cases under the Obama administration where people were able to administratively close their cases. And so they're no longer in front of an immigration judge. They don't have any more hearings scheduled. People that have these orders from the immigration judge, if they go through a checkpoint now, are now being placed back into removal proceedings. So if somebody has this type of order, most people were probably represented by attorneys, and hopefully their attorneys have advised them not to be, you know, passing between Benson and Douglas, or, you know, south of Tucson, or in the Aravaipa area where there's checkpoints, or, you know, the agricultural center as you go out towards Blythe, or as you're coming back in from Blythe near California. People will end up in removal proceedings if they are stopped by Border Patrol. You know, I think the same principle applies, that you can try to remain silent. I think it's, again, very difficult for people, and people that are already in the system, like people with these administratively closed cases, they're going to be sunk because they, you know, CBP or the Border Patrol already knows that the person is here and is undocumented, and that closed case is now going to be reopened. So be vigilant and stay away.
And something that I would like to add on the checkpoints is just, especially if you work with any clients that are DACA recipients, and then they have any other type of work authorization permit, I would caution them to really be prepared on how to answer the questions, because they ask you, the first question, just as Judy said, is, are you a U.S. citizen? So you have to say no, because you're not a U.S. citizen, but then you have to be able to communicate with the CBP agent or the Border Patrol agent, like what your status is, that you're legally here in the country, because that's something that often happens, and we have heard of really awful stories from different people that have had a work permit and they haven't been able to advocate for themselves. But just make sure that you do it in a calm tone and that you're always proactive, because if you do say that you're a U.S. citizen when you're not, that's a crime. And
a false claim to U.S. citizenship also prevents you from getting any kind of immigration benefit, pretty much, ever again. So there's no waiver for making a false claim to U.S. citizenship. I call it the kiss of death. It really needs to not happen. But yeah, stay away from those CBP checkpoints. So we'll talk a little bit about what happens next. Let's say they find out that you're not here lawfully, or you say that you're not here lawfully. What happens next? The example that I know best, of course, is in the Phoenix area, but it happens down in Tucson as well. You know, you're taken to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement office. They fingerprint the person, they'll take a picture. And as I say here, they start asking a million questions. You know, they're going to ask about your parents. They ask your parents' names. They ask what their status is. They ask how you entered, when you entered, how you entered. They ask about your children, a million questions. And, you know, if somebody has maintained their silence previously and hasn't indicated where they're from, this is not the time to give up your guard. You still have to maintain silence regarding where you're from if you want to have any hope of not going into removal proceedings. And it really doesn't matter these days whether you have a criminal history or not, or whether you just got arrested on a DUI. If it's just a traffic stop, you will be placed into removal proceedings. And so you should, if you can, the way you can help yourself and help your immigration attorney down the line is still stop, don't answer these questions. I would like to speak to my attorney before I answer these questions. And this works best if you've never been picked up before, you've never had any encounters with immigration before. If you have and you're in the system, it's less likely that an attorney will be able to file a motion to suppress the evidence if there was, say, an illegal stop or something, or that there's no evidence that you're from a foreign country because you haven't provided any.
So once again, the key here for people to remember is that tell your clients and recommend them that they should remain silent. They should not give any information, just that they want to speak to an attorney. And another thing that I would like to add is to make sure that they don't sign anything, because typically they want them to sign their voluntary departure. So making sure that they're not signing without actually talking to an attorney.
Exactly. And just a couple other pointers, you know, false names. I always think, I have so many clients that give false names, and it's like, well, why are you doing that? You know, they're going to fingerprint you. They'll be able to know who you are, regardless of if you use 20 different false names. So it doesn't really help you, and it's not good. And it's something that's pointed out by the ICE attorneys that you gave false information later down the road. Don't do it. It doesn't help you. And again, false claims to U.S. citizenship, any post-1996 false claims, there is no waiver for them, except for U visas. But it's getting harder and harder to get a U visa these days. So we really want to keep people out of removal proceedings, even if they have, petitions for relief pending. One important point is that people will get assigned an alien number, or what we call an A number. This number, it starts with A, and it has, well, we used to say 8 or 9 numbers. Now we're up to 9 numbers. And it's super important for being able to find the person, that they get that number so the family or a lawyer can locate them later. So if they can scribble that down, ask the officer what the A number is, that's important. And just as with this next slide here, Reina was saying, don't sign anything. If you don't, if they give you a paper that's got English on it and you don't understand it, please don't sign it. There will be a lot of pressure to sign things, but don't do it. There also be a lot of pressure to convince people to take voluntary departure. The officer says, if you're going to fight your case, you'll be in prison or detention for 6 months, which I used to tell people was a lie, but these days it's getting harder and harder to get out of detention. But it typically doesn't take that long if you have no criminal history. So, the ICE officers are not your friends. They will lie to you baldly. do not sign for voluntary departure. Tell your clients not to sign for voluntary departure. Exits have huge implications for all kinds of different relief. It subjects people to what we call a 10-year bar if they have a way to immigrate through a family member. If somebody has a U visa pending and they're outside and they can't get back in within 90 days, they'll never be able to adjust to become a permanent resident. So super important. The basic advice, exactly what Reina just said, is don't sign anything unless you're 100% sure you understand it, and even then you probably shouldn't. Tell the officer you want to have a hearing in front of an immigration judge. So the next thing is, yes, ICE can release you on what's called your own recognizance, particularly if you don't have any criminal history. That is still happening, but much less so. We're seeing a lot of people, even though they have no criminal history at all, even DACA recipients getting sent to Florence or Eloy, the two detention centers that we have in Arizona. So it's sort of a, well, it's a crapshoot, right? It depends what officer you have and who the supervisor is that day. They can release you without paying any bond. That's what an OR release is. They can also ask you to pay a bond while you're there at the ICE ERO office. They can often be very, very ridiculous and tell somebody, well, you have to have somebody, your family member, come down here in an hour. Let's say they live in Mesa, there's no way they're going to get down to the Phoenix ICE office that quickly. And then they say, well, you know, he didn't come on time, or they're not, you know, had circumstances, they're knocking on the door, but it's after hours. They won't let them in, and then they send a person to Florence or Eloy. So one thing you can tell people to do is start getting their bond fund, you know, put money aside in an account, because there are going to be expenses if they do get picked up, which is more and more likely these days. Detention is more likely, I would say, in the last year and a half. Certainly if there's a criminal history, the person generally does have a right to a bond hearing in front of the immigration judge. The judge will be looking at, you know, are you a danger to society, or are you a flight risk? Are you going to show up for your next court hearing? Depending on what kind of criminal history there is, you may be subject to mandatory detention. And in those cases, you're not going to be able to attempt to get out until 6 months have gone by. And then an attorney would have to file either for what's called a Rodriguez bond, or in some cases, if judges are denying it anyway, they may have to file a habeas corpus action. But, you know, you can have a DUI that doesn't make you, you know, subject to mandatory detention, but judges don't like it. You know, they don't like it when somebody has a DUI. And they're going to say, hey, I think you're a danger to society. No bond. So it's serious stuff. We really need to try and encourage people to keep themselves out of these situations to the extent that they can. Any comments there, Reina, about?
I would just like to emphasize the fact that it is extremely important that you communicate with your clients that even 1 or 2 drinks can mean a DUI, and then that would put them in a really bad predicament in terms of immigration. So the consequences are too great. Always have a designated driver, or making sure that you are not drinking and driving, and just period is just too dangerous at this moment. And anytime you can also, like, besides of your immigration consequences, it's too dangerous to be doing such an act. And it's not to shame people or to tell them what to do or how to live their lives, but I think it is important that they know the consequences of what could happen.
And, you know, as we were saying previously, it doesn't even need to be a DUI. It's, do you have a light on the back of your license plate? You know, some of these are probably pretextual for racial profiling, and there sometimes are ways to challenge that. But, you know, I'd say also keep your car in good maintenance. Make sure your windshield isn't cracked. Make sure those kids are in car seats. You know, make sure there is a light on the back. Make sure you have a plate on the back. Having a driver's license is a different matter, but you aren't going to get stopped for that. But there are things you can do to protect yourself, or at least keep yourself perhaps from being stopped. You know, get a designated driver if you've had a few. And this is just sort of a list of what clients can carry with them. You know, I don't know if domestic violence shelters provide business cards. Usually, yeah. So that's encourage people to keep those with them. I think people are under stress, and I know my memory goes when I'm stressed out, right? And if you don't have the phone number, and nobody memorizes phone numbers these days, right? It's all in their cell phone. Down at the bottom, we put, you know, memorize a few contact numbers. Do you know what your mom's cell phone number is? Well, you're not going to have your phone with you. They will, you know, they put your cell phone, if you're detained, they put your cell phone in your property, and you don't have that. And it can be weeks before people sometimes get contact with their family members, because people are trying to figure out where they are. And if you can't call out because you can't remember the number, you're in a bad situation. You know, if you have an attorney, if the person has an attorney, the attorney's business card obviously is helpful. Again, those red Know Your Rights cards are great. If somebody is a permanent resident, the law says you are required to keep your permanent resident card, not a copy, with you at all times. It's a federal misdemeanor if you don't. A lot of people keep copies of it, and I guess that's okay, but and obviously there are many people that are still in process to get their papers. You know, they may have a valid driver's license and a work permit, but often people don't carry them with them. Well, that, you know, frankly, it just raises questions for law enforcement. If somebody speaks Spanish, no English, and they don't have their license with them, well, they may be perfectly authorized to be in this country, but if they can't prove it, that's going to be an issue. So please encourage people that they have these documents, to have them with them. Fake documents are a real problem. You know, you can be prosecuted criminally for having those in your possession, and it's a sure sign that somebody isn't a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. So don't carry false documents. And I think people shouldn't also carry their country of origin documents either. But that's debatable, because some law enforcement will let you go if you get stopped for something. So people have to have that debate. Anything else there, Raina?
No, I would say that especially if there's undocumented people that are driving and then they have a uniform, we encourage people to have an extra shirt that you can change, or like a extra, like a tire that you can put in when you're driving from home to work and from work to home, because in case if you do get pulled over, they can't search your car unless they have a warrant, but at least you want to give them less things that they can associate that you are working and that you don't have the documentation, because then that can lead to potential criminal convictions like identity theft and all these bad stuff.
Yeah. So now we're going to sort of move to what happens if ICE or police officers come to the shelter door. This is really probably not a very comprehensive exploration of these issues, and I'm sure most shelters have their own attorneys who have painstakingly gone over policies or have developed policies for each shelter. There are, you know, federal laws. If shelters get funding from different sources, like the violence against, what is it? I have to look at my notes there. What is it? The Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, that's what it is, or the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, that prevents disclosure of identifying information of clients at a shelter. And the Violence Against Women Act, also prevents disclosure of certain identifying information. So to a certain extent, it depends on the shelter and what kind of funding you get, but the Violence Against Women Act is, you know, it's sort of everybody. So, you know, you should know if ICE or police come to the door, that you have some very strong protections for refusing to give information. And then there's this whole protocol that shelter workers should be going through if by chance, and I don't think it happens very often, that you're going to see ICE coming to the door. But it could happen, or they could phone, and there needs to be policies in place to make sure that information isn't inadvertently or purposefully given to law enforcement when they don't need it, or they're not allowed to get it. So it looks like we have a question here. So Reina answered that. Yeah, I think that's a great answer as well. What do you do if you're allowed to be in the United States because you have DACA? Can you still keep your government's ID with you, a matrícula consular, for example? Yeah, I don't think that's a problem. You're already identified as being a foreign national because you filed an application, but obviously you want to show your license, which most DACA people should have. Having some technical difficulties here. This is a link to a flyer that, or ACESDV, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but they do really great work for immigrant survivors of violence. But it's a really sort of succinct flyer for shelter workers, to all the points to keep in mind, and this is really based off of that. And I love their first thing: take a breath, don't rush, take your time and ask questions, is the first thing to do if ICE is at the door. You know, try to remember that just because they're saying something, it's sort of the same advice that we're giving our clients, right? Don't have them pressure you into doing something that you really don't want to do. If they say they're police, well, you know, what police are you? Are you with immigration? Who exactly are you with? And you really should not be providing any information. Do not let them into the shelter. Ask them what they want. Are they looking for information, or do they want to go in after somebody? And just like for a home, I'm going to say home invasion, just if, the same thing if they're at, you know, a client's door, it's the same thing for a shelter. It's a home. They need a signed judicial warrant. It's, again, not an administrative warrant that some supervisor over at the ICE office signs. That warrant is administrative warrant by ICE is not sufficient, and you can tell them that they cannot enter. I'm sure, you know, most shelters are going to have policies about what to do, and a first line person isn't maybe even going to get into some of this stuff. But you do want to ask to see that warrant. Check the first line person or perhaps a supervisor, because I think in most cases policies are going to say you need to, you know, contact your supervisor, and you can tell that officer, look, I can't let you do anything. I need to go talk to my boss first, you know. So use that line, and I'm sure that will help. And it delays things and kind of calms things down a bit. So even if you see something and you think it's signed by a judge, you do not let that officer come in. Again, you've got good federal law that protects disclosure of that identifying information, and certainly not to come and get somebody unless they have that order. If it gets to the point where somebody is going to be taken away because there does happen to be a judicial warrant, which I highly doubt is ever going to really happen because they never have them. They only have their own little self-signed warrants. But do some prep with this client before they leave. Try to get contact information from that client. See if you can, if that person has an attorney, or if there's an attorney that you know, try and have them talk to that attorney before they leave the shelter. It may be kind of quick, but you know, in the meantime, while the officer is talking to the supervisor, or you're going to get the supervisor, have somebody else contact that client and let them know what's going on. And again, you know, using that line, contacting the supervisor. And this is just what we've talked about before, is making sure, you know, I'm sure most shelters do, or service providers are going to have written policies that have been reviewed by the agency's lawyers. Have you read it? What does it say? Are you getting training on this stuff? That's really something that I think the shelters should be providing for their staff. I'm sure that is happening. You know, whenever you call a shelter, you always get the line, we can't confirm or deny that Maria is here. That's also a line you can use with this officer, unless you see that judicial warrant, and then, you know, supervisor can intervene. There's a couple of ICE memos about enforcement actions. So far they haven't been overturned yet, but it's just hard to say what's going on right now with the Trump administration. But the 2011 ICE memo says that there is what we call sensitive locations. What's interesting, it includes schools, hospitals, places of worship, funerals, weddings, or other public religious ceremonies, or a site during a public demonstration. But domestic violence shelters are not listed. But there is another memo, a 2007 memo, that says that ICE is supposed to use prosecutorial discretion when they encounter survivors, and they discourage officers from making arrests at domestic violence shelters, etc., other sensitive locations. I don't know if that's still good guidance these days, because Trump in his first 90 days got rid of prosecutorial discretion, and there is no special sensitivity right now for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault. So I think you can't really rely on these memos, that they will go after people. And even with these memos in those days, you know, 2007 to 2011 up till 2016, it was never a wholesale prohibition that they won't come after survivors. The general rule, however, was that enforcement action had to have prior approval by a supervisor. That was sort of the safety catch. I have to say, though, I had somebody who was stopped on a civil traffic. She was speeding on her way to work. She had already filed for a U visa as a victim of domestic violence. I spoke to the ICE officer on a Saturday. I handed over her, you know, her receipt notice for her U visa, explained that she was a victim of domestic violence, and I said, "Can you please, you know, let her go?" And the officer just laughed at me. So if this memo was being enforced, they could have used prosecutorial discretion not to take her into custody. She was taken into custody. She was released OR. She didn't have to pay a bond. She did not go into detention, but they placed her into removal proceedings. So this is, I believe, going to be happening with more and more frequency, and we need to remind our clients not to be speeding down the freeway. DPS, I think, is particularly, the Department of Public Safety, Highway Patrol is particularly notorious for calling ICE when they have any suspicion that somebody is in the country unlawfully.
And something to say there, I mean, you're not powerless, and something that I would like to remind you of, it's like it is extremely important that the shelter or the institution that you work with, that they have clear policies in place about what to do if ICE comes into it. I know that Judy already mentioned best practices, but it is important that everybody gets trained on that, because a clerical error can actually mean a possible deportation for a client or someone that you care about. So that's something that we want to be very cognizant about.
Yeah. And then this section here, this section 239 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, it's sort of going into the weeds a little bit, and it's more sort of probably designed for immigration attorneys, but there are some provisions that might be able to be used to protect survivors. You know, ICE, for example, can't rely solely on abuser-provided information to arrest somebody. Or put them into removal proceedings if they are a self-petitioner under the Violence Against Women Act, or they have a U visa which is a visa for victims of crime, or a T visa as a victim of trafficking, severe trafficking. So they can't rely solely on what say the abuser calls up and says, "Oh, arrest my wife, she's here illegally." They have to, ICE has to corroborate that information independently. And then I suppose they go to their computer and then they see that the person maybe has filed a U visa and they say, "Oh, you know, I've independently corroborated that." I think the key here is that if you know your client has an attorney, is to alert that attorney that there are certification requirements. The ICE has to actually put it on what's called the notice to appear, which is the charging document, that they have independently certified the information about alienage, that all of their information didn't come from the abuser if one of those applications is already filed. You know, this law doesn't prevent ICE from arresting people that they are here unlawfully if they can get that other information. But there are attorneys who are trying to think of some issues, you know, what we call the fruit of the poisonous tree. Well, okay, you didn't get it directly from you got this information from the abuser, but how are you independently verifying it if I've provided you the information in the U visa? And so this, what we call in Fourth Amendment suppression law, fruit of the poisonous tree, that you can't, you know, take that poisoned fruit, which is really basically information that's already been provided to you. So there are some arguments that attorneys can make to try to maybe stop removal proceedings. And I think all of us need to start thinking more creatively about ways we can protect survivors here. And there's, you know, there's some specific concerns these days for U visa. It's hard to do this without having feedback from people. But I'm sure that many of the shelters are dealing with survivors that have applied for these U visas, which are, it's a path to permanent residency for people who have been victims of certain crimes. They're enumerated in the statute, but domestic violence and sexual assault are two of the most common forms of criminal victimization that people can apply for a visa for. But there's some issues, I think, for survivor protection that we need to think about in terms of U visas. In all cases for U visas, you have to get a certificate from the law enforcement agency or the prosecutor or the judge that says that the victim was cooperative. And we need to be asking ourselves these days, depending on what law enforcement jurisdiction you're dealing with, is it safe to send that survivor to that police station by herself? Is this an agency that could potentially turn on somebody and talk to ICE? I don't think, for example, that the Phoenix Police Department would do that. But there are smaller jurisdictions where we all really need to know what's happening in our particular jurisdiction. Do we know police officers there? Can we talk to them? Or is there some danger, and that perhaps it might be better for the advocate to go get that certification themselves? And just sort of as a practice thing, I've seen, and other advocates in the Phoenix area have seen changes in law enforcement agency practice on issuing certifications for U visas. The Phoenix Police Department, for example, used to provide certifications even if your survivor had criminal history. The fact that they're giving this certification doesn't mean that the person is necessarily going to get a U visa. The Vermont Service Center of Immigration is the one that ultimately gives that visa, and so they don't have to feel like they are actually giving somebody an immigration benefit, but they are increasingly failing to give certifications if the person has criminal history, more serious criminal history, such as drug trafficking or drug use. But I think it's something where we really need to work as a united front together to try to advocate for better policies and practices by these local law enforcement agencies. Are we developing relationships with these police forces? Do they know, you know, about the power and control wheel? Do they know that self-medication may have led to somebody using drugs because they didn't get the help that they needed as a result of their victimization? Are we developing or cultivating relationships with ICE and CBP? I think that's something that's incumbent upon all of us to do now, to educate them about violence against survivors and how that affects them, and you know, that they need to have a more expansive view of being able to provide benefits, and providing the certificate isn't necessarily the end-all step, but we need to encourage them to, you know, to continue giving certificates to people that may have a criminal past. They are still going to have to apply for a waiver, for example, in front of USCIS. But it's just something I think as a community that we all need to think of. It's a real concern now that we're seeing these faster times in immigration court, and in some cases judges not allowing continuances and ordering removal of survivors. For service providers that are helping people with immigration applications, I am quite sure that you all use your PO boxes or a safe address, but it's sort of more important now than ever to make sure that happens. So that right now the policy of the Vermont Service Center where these applications are sent has always been that they will not, even if somebody is deportable and they deny an application, that they will not send them to ICE for removal. But that may change, and it's really important not to have addresses on applications that might put that survivor in trouble. And so I wanted to also point out how long it's taking for U visa applications and VAWA. I mean, VAWA, at least from time of filing to time of adjudication, it's well over a year at this point. U visas, 3.5 years from time of filing to just being placed on the waiting list. And that's a result of immigration's own backlog. They just don't have enough people adjudicating these applications. If they did, people would be getting their work permits in 3 to 4 months. Instead, they're waiting 3.5 years to be placed on the wait list, which also gives you what's called deferred action and the right to have a work permit. It's really pretty unconscionable. But then after that, you have to wait another 3 years on the waiting list. Sorry, that shouldn't say waiting list, but 3 years in deferred action. And that's a problem with there's not enough visas available. There's only 10,000 a year. And at this point, I think there's 60, well, I don't know the numbers exactly, but 60 to 70,000 are on a wait list right now, and there's only 10,000 available a year. So there's this huge backlog. And then just built in within the statute, you have to wait survivor has to wait 3 years after the U has been approved to file for permanent residency or the green card. So during this time period, if somebody is, like my client that just got picked up on the traffic violation, is placed into removal proceedings, and in that particular case, this client, she applied about 3 years ago, and she's on the verge of getting off of, the, I guess, a pre-adjudication waiting list onto the waiting list, the deferred action. So she's almost at the point of getting her work card, but she's now in removal proceedings. Many of the judges now are not granting continuances for people that don't have approved U visas. In some cases, they're not dismissing the cases even after the person does have the U visa. They're saying, well, we need to wait until she becomes a permanent resident. This is a huge problem. People are appealing, but we don't know yet what's going to happen. So, my advice here is get those applications filed as soon as possible, but make sure that you do get help on, more complicated or these red flag cases. If there's issues regarding there's any entries or exits, more than one, if there are different grounds of inadmissibility or deportability, false claims to U.S. citizenship, deportation orders or removal orders, or any kind of criminal history, you really need to have the person talk to an attorney before they file their application.
And if you don't know how to pre-screen, I would say, Yuri, because this can be really overwhelming if you're trying to help people and you're not an attorney. Rule of thumb, if you do not know if the person has complications, always ask if they have had contact with law enforcement. And if they say yes, like then that's when you really want to make sure that their case gets screened by an attorney.
Right, and there may be ways to also help by getting Freedom of Information Act requests in right away, because those records are really helpful to attorneys to be able to assess a case and find out what kind of contact people have had with, you know, Border Patrol or ICE in the past. You know, and you have to say that the Vermont Service Center that handles these cases is getting harder and harder. They are denying people, even, you know, I mentioned this, we had a task force meeting, immigration task force meeting here at the coalition a couple weeks ago, and they are denying cases where people have been granted waivers of all grounds of inadmissibility, and there's been no criminal history since, no immigration violations since. They are denying at the point of adjustment of status. So, and I don't know exactly why that's happening, if it's because they're frustrated with the backlogs. The law hasn't changed, it's just the implementation of policy. They're getting much tougher, and it's really rough. People, we just need to make sure that everything is listed, and then we're going to have to fight these cases on appeal for, you know, these sort of unreasonable measures that are being taken by the Immigration Service. So there's so much work to be done. It's crazy. Okay, so back to know your rights. Here we go. Don't open the door. No, don't talk. Don't sign anything. Don't lie. If you have a driver's license, show it. I think, and again, this is the debatable point about whether you should show your country ID documents. I think, you know, that makes the Immigration Service, it makes ICE's case for them. So I don't think people should be showing their ID documents. But, you know, in the city of Phoenix, it works sometimes that maybe they'll just get fingerprinted. I mean, the officers are concerned about officer safety and whether the person has a warrant. So often if you don't have an ID, and it doesn't really matter whether you have a passport, they're still going to take you to the station and print you and see whether you have a warrant for your arrest. In some cases, or in many cases, the officers are nice and will let people go, but there's no assurance these days. My personal opinion is that Highway Patrol calls pretty much every time. So regardless of whether you have the, yeah, you know, if you admit that you're not here lawfully, they're going to turn you over to ICE, and ICE will come and pick you up. And then just all those things about, you know, advising clients to try and keep cars in good condition so that these pretexts for stopping people don't turn into a basis for getting deported. Any other things that we should advise clients to do that we haven't mentioned already right now?
No, I would say that there's three main things that I would encourage people to practice with their clients, especially when they have encounter with law enforcement. Always asking, am I free to go? I literally work with moms and parents who do not speak English, and we just practice in English because that's typically the language that they're going to have to say it. But the three main questions that I want you to remember: one, am I free to go? Two, am I being arrested? And then three, I would like to speak to my attorney. That's not really a question, it's a statement, but you can think about it in that bucket.
Yeah, that's great. And so they're practicing this in English, even though they may not be speakers of English, yeah.
Yeah, and then they're super awesome because then they take little notes, and I encourage them to like write them down how they would pronounce it. So then they have different pronunciation in Spanish typically, and then I give them the proper like spelling in English. So that they typically have both, and then they just practice, and we just continue to do it until they feel really comfortable.
Yeah, that's really a great technique. And so the next couple of slides are really sort of state resources for survivors. The Florence Project, well, actually PLAN, the organization that I'm a member of, has funded this Justice for Immigrants and Family Project, and our attorney works as an employee of the Florence Project. We're providing free legal services for non-detained low-income immigrants that are facing removal, as long as they're basically living north of, well, if they're in the jurisdiction of the Phoenix Immigration Court. Domestic violence, sexual assault are two of our main priorities. So there's more information on our website, and we have intake questionnaires available there as well. If you have a client that you think meets our criteria, it's under 200% of the federal poverty level, we'd be happy to have you fill out. There's intakes in Spanish and English that you can access at that website there. And of course, you know, Catholic Charities, Community Services has been in the Valley for decades, as well as Friendly House. They also provide legal services. And then we have Keep Tucson Together. They provide Know Your Rights clinics on the first and third Saturdays. And I think each day is designated for different purposes, so it may be good to Google Keep Tucson Together and double check. Margot Cohen is the attorney that has spearheaded that for many decades. And then there's a lot of really great national resources for immigrant survivors. ACESDV that I mentioned earlier, they have a lot of documents for service providers, for survivors themselves, all kinds of materials. You know, go to their website, and it's all free for the taking. NDALON, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, has this great flyer that provides pictures and what happens if I'm stopped by ICE. It's in Spanish and English. Kids in Need of Defense also has some great resources, as well as the Florence Project. Florence Project more is background information for people that are detained. There's some great information there about how to find somebody that's been detained, and then materials for self-representation as well. And I think that's it. So I don't know if there's any further questions that people might have, or any other resources, Raina, that you're aware of that we haven't put up here.
You can always go to Aliento AC /resources, and I'll type it down right here. We have mental health resources as well that are at low cost for undocumented people, and some medical resources. So we just pretty much curated a list of resources that we have there, that also for education. So then if you are working with undocumented or DACA individuals, that's something that you can go and utilize as a resource as well.
I may have to use some of those resources for some clients of mine. If you have medical resources for undocumented clients, that's great to know.
So if anybody has any follow-up questions for Judy or Raina, go ahead and type them either into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll just give a few minutes to see if anybody's got anything. Okay, doesn't look like anyone's typing. So we can go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And a big thanks to you, Judy, and to you, Raina. Thank you so much for this information. This is definitely really important information and timely, as you both know.
Well, and thank you for all your good work, folks that are listening. We appreciate the opportunity to provide this to help all our mutual clients.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And if you ever need to reach out, like I I am available. You can contact us through our website, and we're happy to provide this information. And it was an honor to share this webinar with Judy. Thank you, Ginger, for putting this together too.
Thank you so much.